At 68 years old, her own son called her a burden, but the house he wanted to sell would be the very thing that saved them both. Welcome to Stories Unhurried. If you're new here, take a moment, settle in, and subscribe. These are stories meant to be listened to slowly, the way good things deserve. Now, let us begin. Corinne. Bellamy did not mean to eavesdrop on her son that night. She only came downstairs for a glass of water because the apartment in Houston ran its air conditioning so cold that her throat went dry by midnight and her lower back ached in a dull, stubborn way that no amount of shifting in that narrow guest bed could fix. But sometimes words find you precisely when you are least ready to carry them. Her hand was on the kitchen door handle when she saw the thin stripe of light beneath it, heard the low murmur of her son's voice on the other side. Not angry, not raised. Worse measured the way people speak when they have already made up their minds and are only rehearsing the announcement. We can't keep going like this, Kara. The property in Briar Hollow has to go on the market. And Mom, we need to start looking at assisted living options. Something with structure, professionals. Corinne's fingers tightened around the door handle. The glass in her other hand was still empty, but her mouth had gone completely dry. Then Kara's voice, and this was the part that would stay with Corinne longer than anything else because Kara did not agree easily. There was a pause, a breath. And then her daughter-in-law spoke carefully, the way someone speaks when they know they are about to lose an argument they believe they should win. Your mom deserves a say in this, Dalton. She's still sharp, she's not confused. She just doesn't have anywhere to be herself in this apartment. Another pause. Corinne could picture her son pinching the bridge of his nose, the gesture he'd inherited from his father, without ever knowing it. I know that, but the numbers don't care about that, Kara. The mortgage extension got denied. The Ridgemont deal fell through. I owe Garrett $60,000 that I told you was 40, and the only asset we have left that's actually worth anything is 20 acres of dead pecan trees in a town nobody's heard of. I'm not being cruel. I'm being realistic. Kara said nothing for a long moment, then very quietly. And the assisted living. It would free up the room for an office. I could take remote clients. It would give her proper care, people who actually know what they're doing, instead of her scrubbing our kitchen at 5 in the morning like she owes us rent. He said it like that. Like her care for his household was a debt she was trying to pay off. Like the coffee she made every morning and the laundry she folded with such precision were symptoms of a woman who didn't know her place rather than a mother who was terrified of becoming invisible. Corinne did not open the door. She did not drop the glass. She simply turned around and walked back down the hallway so slowly that her bare feet made no sound at all on the hardwood, as if she were afraid that moving too quickly would crack open the thing swelling behind her ribs and let it become noise. Her room. Dalton called it Mom's room, though there was nothing of hers in it that couldn't be packed into a single suitcase in 15 minutes, was at the far end of the hall, a twin bed pushed against the wall, a small dresser, a chair by the window that faced the parking garage of the building next door. Everything was clean and adequate and entirely without warmth, the way a waiting room is clean and adequate. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed her hands flat on her knees. She could still hear Dalton's voice through the wall, though the words had blurred into a low hum. Once she caught the phrase, dead orchard. Once the phrase, fair market value. Each phrase was a small stone dropping into still water. She had moved to Houston 8 years ago, 3 months after Harlan died. Dalton had driven all the way to Briar Hollow in a rented SUV, packed her things, while she stood in the kitchen unable to decide which pots to take, and told her that nobody should live alone at her age in a town that was half empty. She had believed him. She had believed that living near her son was what a mother was supposed to want, that proximity was the same as belonging. But proximity, she had learned, could be its own kind of exile. Every morning she rose before anyone else. She made coffee. She wiped the countertops. She folded laundry with the careful hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime tending. Tending the orchard, tending the garden, tending a sick husband through 3 years of treatment that everyone knew would not work, but nobody said aloud. She set out breakfast for the grandchildren, cut toast into triangles the way she'd once cut it for Dalton, placed napkins beside each plate. And nearly everything she did was wrong. The mugs were in the wrong cabinet. The towels were folded in thirds instead of halves. The soup she made for the children was not the kind they ate at school. Kara never scolded her, Kara only sighed. But there are sighs that land heavier than any reprimand, sighs that say, "I will redo this after you go to bed," sighs that say, "You are making more work, not less." Dalton was always busy. He left early and returned late with his phone pressed against his ear, speaking in numbers and percentages and phrases that Corinne did not try to understand. When he spoke to her, his sentences were short and fast, as though a longer sentence might accidentally create an obligation. "Rest, Mom." "You don't need to do that, Mom. Don't touch my files. These aren't things you'd understand." At first, Corinne was hurt. Then she grew accustomed to it. And then slowly a thought began to form that was worse than any hurt. The thought that perhaps he was right. Perhaps these hands that had grafted pecan limbs, stoked wood stoves, brined cucumbers, kneaded dough, nursed a dying man and raised a boy were now only good for getting in the way. That thought did not arrive like a blow. It settled like dust one day at a time until it covered everything. Corinne sat on the bed for a long time after the voices stopped. In the silence, she heard Dalton mention the orchard one last time. He called it the Briar Hollow lot, as if it were a line item on a spreadsheet, and not the place where Harlan had carved their son's initial into the oldest pecan tree on his 5th birthday. She closed her eyes. Behind her lids, she saw Harlan standing in the orchard at dawn, sleeves rolled past his elbows, sweat on his forehead, but a grin on his face. She saw Dalton as a boy running between the rows in spring, his shirt dusted with pollen, calling for his father. She saw the stone house with the fire going in the kitchen, the wide oak table, the smell of pecan pie just out of the oven, and Harlan's voice saying that land could be poor, but if you loved it right, it wouldn't abandon you. And now that land was being discussed as a commodity. And she, who had spent half her life in that house, was being discussed as a logistical problem. Much later, Corinne did not know what time it was. She knelt beside the bed and pulled her suitcase from underneath. The dust on the leather made her cough softly. She opened the small dresser and took out 3 dresses, faded, but pressed and folded them with care. She took Harlan's wool scarf, the one he wore on cold mornings when he went out to check the trees before sunrise. She pressed it against her face and breathed in, searching for a scent that was almost gone. Then she reached into the bottom of her sewing box and pulled out the brass key. It was cold in her palm, heavier than she remembered, as though it did not only open a door, but reopened a corridor in her life she had sealed shut. The key to the stone house in Briar Hollow. She had kept it for 8 years. Dalton had never asked about it. Perhaps he assumed the locks had been changed, or that the door no longer mattered. But Corinne had carried this key through every move, every rearrangement of her shrinking life, tucked beneath thread and thimbles, where no one would look. She placed it in the pocket of her coat. She placed the photograph from the drawer Harlan behind her. One hand on her shoulder, the other holding a young Dalton, the pecan blossoms white behind them, into the suitcase between the dresses. She did not cry. Tears come when you still hope to be asked to stay. This was not that. Before dawn, she put on her old coat and carried the suitcase out. The apartment was dark. In the kitchen, she stopped. Out of a habit so deep it lived in her muscles rather than her mind, she brewed coffee, set out the bread on a plate, and wiped a ring of water from the counter. Then she took a small piece of paper and wrote in a hand that was slow and slightly trembling, "Mama's going home." She placed the note beneath Dalton's coffee mug, the blue one, the one she always filled first. Then she opened the front door and stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her, and no one woke up, and no one called her name, and no one asked where she was going. The pain was immediate. a pressure behind her sternum that made each breath feel weighted. But beneath the pain, something very old was stirring. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was the stone house calling. Or perhaps it was Harlan's voice from years ago murmuring somewhere deep in memory that a pecan tree can look dead for years. But if the roots still hold, it hasn't finished yet. The first bus left Houston before the city fully woke. Corinne sat in the back with the suitcase wedged beside her feet and both hands clutching Harlan's scarf against her chest, holding the last familiar thing she had. Through the window, Houston retreated, the wide highways, the strip malls, the billboards promising injury attorneys and storage units and new developments, all sliding away like a life she had tried to enter but never truly inhabited. The route west unrolled through flat ranch land, then slowly into the hill country, where the earth turned from black clay to pale limestone, and the live oaks gave way to cedar and mesquite. The light changed. It became drier, sharper, the kind of light that doesn't flatter anything, but shows everything true. Corinne watched the land and recognized it the way you recognize the hand of someone you love, not by looking, but by feel. The bus driver announced that the line no longer ran to Briar Hollow. The route had been shortened 2 years ago for lack of passengers. Anyone going further would need to find a ride or walk. Corinne stood at the crossroads with her hand on the suitcase, watching the bus pull away in a cloud of caliche dust. For a moment she felt very small on that white road with the open country ahead, and the town still hidden behind the low hills. She could call Dalton, one call, and he would know where she was. Perhaps he would be angry. Perhaps he would drive out to tell her she was being stubborn and irrational, that the sale could be renegotiated, that the assisted living idea was just something they'd been exploring. But Corinne knew that if she heard her son's voice right now, she might soften. And if she softened too soon, she would return to that small room and go on living like a chair pushed into a corner, present but unoccupied. She put the phone deep in her coat pocket, tightened her grip on the suitcase handle, and walked. The road to Briar Hollow was not long for a young person. For Corinne, it was a test. The sun climbed. Dust clung to her shoes and the hem of her dress and the wheels of the old suitcase. On every rise, she stopped to breathe. Her back ached. Her knees protested. The hand pulling the suitcase went numb, and she switched to the other. At some point, she looked around and saw no one. Only heard the drone of cicadas in the dry grass and the wind passing through the low brush. The silence was terrifying and clean at the same time, entirely different from the silence in Dalton's apartment. That silence made her feel she was in the way. This silence seemed to be waiting for her to say her own name again. Then she heard it, a thin, broken sound from the brush beside the road. At first, she thought it was a bird. But when she stopped, the sound came again, weak, intermittent. She set the suitcase down and parted the dry brush. A small dog lay curled in the dust, copper-brown fur matted with dirt, ribs visible beneath the skin, one hind leg twisted and raw, caught in wire maybe, or clipped by a truck. When it saw her, it tried to scramble backward, but it was too weak to do more than tremble, its eyes enormous and full of a fear that expected nothing. Corinne lowered herself to the ground beside it. She extended her hand very slowly. She spoke the way you speak to a child who has learned not to trust. "Don't be scared. I'm not in much better shape than you." The dog looked at her. In those wet, exhausted eyes, Corinne saw something that tightened her throat. It did not bark, it did not struggle. It did not ask for help. It simply lay there, accustomed to being left behind. And that look cut her, because only that morning she had walked out of a place she thought was her home, carrying the same quiet certainty that she was no longer needed. She pulled a dress from the suitcase, tore a long strip from the hem, and wrapped the dog's leg the way she had wrapped Harlan's hands when he scraped them on fence wire or cut his palms digging post holes. Her fingers were not as fast as they once were, but they still remembered. The dog trembled but did not bite. When she lifted it, its body was so light she felt a deeper ache of compassion. "Come on," she said to the dog and to herself. "Your name is Copper now." The name came without thought, and it surprised her. Copper for the color of its fur, but also because Harlan had once said that if they ever got a dog to watch the orchard, he'd name it something simple and warm. They never got around to it. Life had too many other things. Then came the illness, then the death, then Houston. There are small intentions you keep putting off until next season, until there's more time, and eventually they seep away like water into dry ground. Corinne carried Copper in one arm and pulled the suitcase with the other. The road was still dusty. The sun was still strong. Her back still ached. But from the moment that small body leaned against her chest, she no longer felt she was walking alone. She had left Houston because she was seen as a burden. But on the road back, she had picked up another burden. The difference was that this one she had chosen. And there are things that, when chosen with tenderness, stop being burdens and become reasons to keep going. The afternoon was tilting toward evening when Briar Hollow appeared after the last bend. The small town sat between dry limestone hills, its stone and clapboard houses quiet under the fading sun. The steeple of the old Lutheran church, standing like a sentinel over the memories of everyone who had ever left. From the distance, Corinne saw the road that led to the edge of town where the Bellamy property sat behind the old pecan trees. Her heart slowed and grew heavier. She did not know what she would find beyond the gate. Perhaps only dust weeds, broken shingles, and a dead orchard. Perhaps the neighbors would look at her the way people look at an old woman who has come back too late. But Copper shifted against her chest and nuzzled into the wool scarf. And Corinne looked down at him, then up at the road ahead. She had left Houston without a single argument. She had left Dalton only a note instead of all the pain she carried. And now, with an old suitcase, her dead husband's scarf, and an injured dog in her arms, she passed the faded wooden sign that read, Briar Hollow Pop. 310, the number itself a wound, because she remembered when it said 840. The Bellamy house stood at the end of a dirt track behind a leaning fence of cedar posts. The pecan trees rose above it, leafless, their branches dark and skeletal against the evening sky. The gate dragged on the ground when she pushed it. Weeds had swallowed the front path. A barn swallow's nest clung to the porch eave like a small fist of mud. Corinne set the suitcase down. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the brass key. It fit. After 8 years, it fit. She had to turn it twice hard, her wrist aching with the effort. But the lock gave with a sound like a held breath released. The door swung open. Dust, old wood, cold air that had not been disturbed in years. The kitchen was dark. The stone fireplace held ash so old it had turned to powder. Harlan's photograph on the mantel their wedding day. His hair still dark, his hand on her waist was filmed with a fine gray layer, as if time itself had been trying to erase him gently. And in the corner, his rocking chair sat exactly where he had left it, angled toward the window that looked out over the orchard, waiting with the patience of furniture for someone who would never sit in it again. Corinne set Copper down on the stone floor. The dog limped 2 steps, sniffed the air, and looked back at her. She walked to the back door and opened it. The orchard. 20 acres of pecan trees stretching up the gentle slope behind the house, and every single one of them looked dead. Gray trunks, bare limbs, cracked earth, brush and Johnson grass grown taller than her head, and the old stone well nearly swallowed by Virginia creeper. The people in town called it the dead orchard. Standing there in the last light, Corinne understood why. But she did not close the door. She stood in the doorway between the cold kitchen and the ruined orchard, and she said very quietly, as if speaking to the trees, to the well, to the man who was no longer there, but whose scarf still held the ghost of cedar smoke and black coffee. I'm here, Harlan. And somewhere deep in the pocket of her coat, the brass key was still warm from her hand. That first night, the kitchen had no electricity, no running water, and no warmth except what Corinne could coax from the old stone fireplace with a handful of dry cedar branches she pulled from the yard. The wood was brittle and caught quickly, throwing a light that jumped and shivered across the walls, finding the outlines of things she had not seen in 8 years. The cast-iron hook above the hearth, the shelf where she once kept the jars of pickled okra, the long crack in the plaster that Harlan had always promised to fix next spring. Copper lay on the stone floor near the fire, his bandaged legs stretched out, his breathing shallow but steady. Every few minutes he lifted his head and looked at her, then at the dark doorway that led to the orchard, then back at her, as though confirming that neither of them had been left alone again. She ate nothing. She drank water from a gallon jug she had bought at the last gas station before the bus route ended. She sat in Harlan's rocking chair, and when the wood creaked beneath her weight, the sound moved through her chest like a voice. Sleep came in fragments. Between them she listened to the wind in the dead branches outside and told herself that in the morning she would begin. She did not yet know what beginning meant. She only knew that staying still was no longer something she could afford. Dawn arrived the color of weak tea. Corinne was already standing in the backyard, surveying the damage in full light for the first time. The orchard was worse than she had imagined in the dark. 20 acres of pecan trees, most of them planted by Harlan's father in the 50s, stood in rows that had lost all order to brush and Johnson grass. The trunks were gray and deeply cracked. Whole limbs had fallen and lay half buried in weeds. The old stone well near the house was wrapped so tightly in Virginia creeper that only the iron crank handle was visible poking through the green like a hand reaching out of water. She started with the well. It was the only source of water she might have, and without water nothing else was possible. The creeper fought her. Its roots had worked into the mortar between the stones, and when she pulled, the vine snapped close to the base and left the roots behind. Her fingernails split, her forearms burned. After an hour of pulling, she had cleared only a third of the well cap, and her hands were raw and trembling. She tried a different approach, sawing through the thickest stems with a kitchen knife she had found in a drawer, its blade so dull it barely cut bread. The angle was wrong, and the knife slipped twice, nicking her thumb. She wrapped it in a strip of cloth torn from the same dress she had used for Copper's leg, and kept going. By mid-morning, the well cap was mostly clear. She leaned over the edge and dropped a pebble. 1 second, 2, a faint plop echoed up from somewhere far below. There was water. How much she could not tell, but the sound alone was enough to make her grip the stone rim and exhale as though she had been holding her breath since Houston. The rope attached to the crank was rotted through. She pulled it up hand over hand, and it came apart in wet gray strings that smelled of mildew and years. Without a rope, the well was useless. She stood there looking down into the dark shaft, her hands stinging her back, locked in a low, continuous ache, and for the first time felt the full weight of what she had chosen. A woman 68 alone with a dull kitchen knife and a dog who could not walk straight. The scale of the ruin around her was not romantic. It was crushing. She sat on the front step and drank water from the jug and pressed her palms flat against the cool stone to ease the burning. Copper limped over and sat beside her, leaning his small body against her leg. "Well," she said to him, "we got the cap off. That's something." Copper looked up at her with an expression that could have been agreement or pity. She chose to read it as agreement. She spent the rest of the morning pulling weeds from around the nearest pecan trunks. The work was slow and graceless. She knelt, yanked, fell back, knelt again. The earth was baked so hard that the roots of even the smallest weeds held fast, and she had to rock each one back and forth until the soil gave. The sun climbed, and the shade from the bare branches offered nothing. Sweat ran into her eyes and stung. By noon, she had cleared a patch no larger than a bedsheet. She stood and looked at it then, at the 20 acres of untouched ruin beyond, and a laugh escaped her. That was half exhaustion and half something she could not name. That was when the voice came from behind the fence. "If you pull like that, you'll put yourself in the ground before you put anything back in it, Kin." She turned. A man stood on the other side of the cedar post fence, leaning on a wooden cane, a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his forehead. His face was deeply lined, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes were sharp and unhurried, the eyes of someone who had spent decades reading the ground for what lay beneath it. Gus Whitfield, 71 years old, retired well digger. Harlan's closest friend for 30 years, the man who had stood beside the grave when they lowered the pine box and had not spoken a single word, because he was the kind of man who believed that grief was private even when it was shared. Corinne had not seen him since the funeral. He did not ask why she had come back. He did not say it was good to see her or that she looked well or any of the things people say to fill the space around discomfort. He looked at the cleared patch, then at the pecan trunks, then at the well with its missing rope, and nodded once as if checking items on a list he had already written in his head. He came through the gate without waiting to be invited, walked to the nearest trunk, and pulled a folding knife from his back pocket. He scraped a small window in the bark, studied it, scraped another spot lower on the trunk, and held the blade up to the light. This one's gone, dead through to the heartwood. He moved to the next tree, repeated the test. This one maybe. See that a faint green thread ran beneath the gray outer bark so thin Corinne had to lean close to see it. That's cambium. Alive. Barely, but alive. He straightened and looked at her with an expression that was not gentle but was not unkind. Dead trees you cut, but if the roots still hold, don't bury them too fast. Something in his voice pressed against her chest. She said nothing. Only watch as he moved to a third trunk, then a fourth, marking each one with a small X or a small O scratched into the bark with his knife. X for dead, O for possible. He worked for an hour without speaking again. When he finished, he had marked 11 trees in the rows closest to the house, 7 X's, 4 O's. Then he left. No goodbye, no promise to return. But late that afternoon, when Corinne went to the gate to bring the empty water jug inside, she found a coil of new rope and a pair of sharpened pruning shears laid on the gatepost. No note, no name. Just the tools placed there, the way someone places a candle in a window, not to make a statement, but to make sure the light reaches. She stood holding the shears for a long time, turning them in her blistered hands. The metal was warm from the sun, and in that warmth, she felt something she had not felt in the apartment in Houston. The sensation of being seen by someone who expected nothing in return, except that she keep going. The next morning, she replaced the well rope, rigged the crank, and drew the first bucket of water. It came up brown and silted, and smelling of limestone, but it was water. She poured it over the roots of the 4 oak trees, and watched it sink into the cracked earth and disappear in seconds, as if the ground had been waiting with its mouth open. On the third day, Mabel Crenshaw appeared. She did not knock. She simply materialized at the gate holding a foil-covered plate in one hand and a look of supreme disapproval on her face. 66 years old, built close to the ground with a voice that could strip paint. Lord have mercy, Corinne Bellamy. I heard you were back, and I told Ray Garcia he was lying because no sane woman would come back to this wreck on purpose. And yet here you are, on your knees in the dirt like you're 25 and bulletproof. I brought pie. It's Pecan. Don't say thank you. It was going stale on my counter, and I didn't want the ants. She was already through the gate before she finished the sentence. She set the plate on the porch step, looked at the well, looked at the cleared patch around the trunks, looked at Copper dozing in the shade, and made a sound that could have been contempt or admiration with Mabel. They were often the same sound. She stayed 4 hours. She said she was only staying 10 minutes. She pulled weeds beside Corinne with a ferocity that suggested a personal grudge against each root. She complained about the heat, the soil, the angle of the sun, the inadequacy of the pruning shears, the foolishness of old women who thought they could raise the dead, and the fact that Bruno, she called Copper Bruno 3 times before Corinne corrected her, was lying in the only shady spot instead of helping. But when Corinne found beneath the weeds near the 4th oak tree a tiny green shoot pushing through the cracked soil, so small and so new that a careless step would have killed it, Mabel stopped talking. She knelt beside it. She touched the soil around it with fingers that were suddenly careful. And she said nothing for a full minute, which was for Mabel the equivalent of a standing ovation. Corinne marked the shoot with a circle of small stones and tied a strip of cloth around a stick beside it so she could find it again. It was not enough to save an orchard. It was not enough to prove anything to anyone. But it was the first proof that beneath the cracked surface, something was still trying. That evening, after Mabel left loudly announcing she would not be back, carrying an empty pie plate she had somehow forgotten to take for 3 hours, Corinne found a small burlap sack of chicken feed on the porch step with a note in Mabel's jagged handwriting. For the dog. So he stops giving my chickens ideas. Corinne smiled. She placed the sack inside and looked out at the orchard in the last light. The 4 oak trees, the single green shoot, the well with its new rope. It was almost nothing. But almost nothing was infinitely more than nothing. On the 5th day, while cleaning out Harlan's old cedar chest in the bedroom, Corinne found the journal. It was beneath a folded work jacket, a tin of wood oil, and a yellowed envelope of tax receipts. A leather-bound notebook, its corners soft with age, its pages swollen from years of humidity. She opened it, and Harlan's handwriting appeared, slanted, firm, unapologetic. And the sight of it made her press her hand against her breastbone, as though holding something in place. Inside were measurements, diagrams, notes on wind direction, rainfall patterns, the angle of the hillside behind the orchard, and drawings, careful detailed drawings of the old stone channel that had once carried water from the spring on the upper ridge down through the Bellamy property and into the orchards below. The channel had been built by Harlan's grandfather during the drought of 1934 and had run for decades before it silted up and was forgotten. Harlan had not forgotten it. Page after page showed his attempts to trace the channel's path, to identify where it was blocked, to calculate whether the spring still flowed. He had measured distances with a tape and marked them against landmarks: the split boulder, the dead live oak, the fence corner, where the old Mayhew property began. He had been close. He had been very close. And then he had gotten sick, and the notebook had gone into the chest, and the chest had gathered dust, and the channel had stayed buried. Corinne brought the journal to Gus that evening. He opened his door with the expression of a man who expected nothing good after sundown. But when he saw the handwriting, his face changed. He sat at his kitchen table and read every page, running his finger along the diagrams, occasionally stopping to close his eyes, as if seeing the terrain behind his lids. He knew where the blockage was, Gus said, finally, his voice rougher than usual. If these measurements are right, the channel isn't just for your orchard. It could feed the Garza place and the Hollowell place below you, maybe even reach the Mackey property if the grade holds. Corinne stood very still. A hope opened in front of her that was enormous and terrifying at the same time. How many people would it take? He looked at her, then back at the journal. A crew, strong backs. The ground's been packed for decades and the stones are locked in tight. If we dig in the wrong spot, it's wasted work. If we dig in the right spot but too slow, the trees that still have living roots will die before the water reaches them. Corinne looked down at Harlan's handwriting. He had not left her a promise. He had left her a path. If nobody starts, she said, there won't ever be a crew. 3 days later, Lone Star Ventures held a public meeting in the town square. The representative was a man in pressed khakis and a blue sport coat with a voice calibrated to sound reasonable rather than persuasive. He spoke of a boutique eco-resort, new road seasonal employment, a destination that would put Briar Hollow on the map. He did not exaggerate. He did not need to. The facts of the town's decline did the persuading for him: the empty houses, the young people gone to San Antonio and Austin, the orchards abandoned one by one, the school that had consolidated with a town 40 minutes away. Mayor Hargrove listened with the heaviness of a man who had watched his town shrink for 20 years. He was not corrupt. He was not greedy. He was tired. He said that Briar Hollow needed to be realistic, that the orchards had not produced in years, that memories alone could not repair the clinic roof or bring back the grocery store. Several heads nodded. Someone in the back muttered that if the land wouldn't grow pecans, it might as well grow money. Corinne stood near the edge of the crowd, her hands still scratched and scabbed. She listened to every number, every projection, every carefully worded reassurance. When Mayor Hargrove asked if anyone wished to speak, she stepped forward. Faces turned. some curious, some pitying, some annoyed. She was not a public speaker. She had spent her life talking to soil, to fire, to trees, to her family. But today, if she stayed silent, Harlan's orchard would be decided like a parcel without an owner. The orchard's not dead. Her voice wavered at first, then steadied. I found shoots. Gus has tested the trunks. There are trees with living cambium. Harlan spent years mapping the old water channel from the ridge spring. If we clear it, the water doesn't just reach my place. It reaches the Gaza orchard and the Hollowell land below. This town dried up because the water stopped, not because the roots died. A man near the front let out a dry laugh. Love doesn't fix roofs, Corinne. It doesn't pay for medicine. She did not answer that. She could not because it was true. Love did not fix roofs, but she had not come here to argue. She had come to say what she knew, and she had said it. And now the words were in the air like seeds that might or might not find soil. She left the square quietly. Mabel followed without a word. Gus walked beside her slowly, his cane tapping the packed earth. Behind them, the Lone Star representative smiled and said something about respecting emotions while focusing on practical solutions. Mayor Hargrove rubbed his forehead. The crowd dispersed with the particular silence of people who have been given a choice they do not want to make. That night, Corinne sat in the kitchen with the journal open on the table, the brass key beside it, the fire low. She did not feel defeated. She felt the way the ground feels after rain that has not yet soaked deep enough damp on the surface still parched below. In the morning, she picked up the pruning shears and went to the slope behind the well, where Harlan's diagrams marked the first section of buried channel. Gus was already there, shovel on his shoulder. Mabel arrived 20 minutes later, scarf tied, crooked, cursing under her breath. I already told you I don't believe in this. I just don't want to read about two old fools dying of heat stroke in the Briar Hollow Gazette, assuming anyone still reads it. They began to dig. The sound of iron striking limestone rang out across the hillside, dry and sharp. Corinne's shovel bounced off packed caliche. Her arms shook with each strike. Blisters from the previous day split and bled, and she wrapped her palms with strips of cloth and kept going. Gus worked methodically, measuring against the journal driving stakes to mark the channel's probable path. Mabel dug with the same fury she brought to everything, insulting the rocks as she pried them loose. By the second day, children from the remaining families drifted over. A boy named Nico brought a bucket. Others brought old bottles of water rags and a lopsided scarecrow they had made from a broomstick, and one of their father's old shirts. They planted it near the dig site like a flag. Corinne put them to work carrying small stones away from the trench, keeping them back from the edges. By the third day, a few older residents appeared at the fence. They watched. Some shook their heads, some stood longer than they intended. Then a woman with a bad hip lowered herself into the trench and moved a few rocks. A retired rancher brought a pickaxe. Nobody announced a change of heart. They just came, did something small, and left the way people in small towns help when words have become too difficult. On the fourth day, they hit the channel stones. The old hand-laid limestone conduit buried under decades of sediment and root mass, but unmistakably there. The curve of the stones matched Harlan's drawing exactly. Gus ran his hand along them and did not speak for a long time. But the center of the channel was blocked by a large boulder wedged between the walls and packed with hardened clay. Everything upstream had backed up behind it. To open the channel, they had to move the boulder, and the boulder did not want to move. They rigged ropes. They levered with the pickaxe. Corinne was in the trench, her dress caked with mud, her hair plastered to her forehead, pulling the rope with both wrapped hands. Gus braced the shovel against the channel wall, his legs trembling with the strain. Mabel stood above, shouting directions that contradicted themselves. The children watched from behind the fence, clutching their water bottles. The boulder shifted. An inch. Then something gave beneath it, not the boulder, but the trench wall. The bank collapsed inward with a sound like a held breath released all at once. Gus lost his footing. He fell sideways into the channel, and a cascade of earth and stone came down on top of him, pinning his left leg beneath the boulder's edge. The children screamed. Mabel lunged forward, but Corinne threw out her arm. The bank was still crumbling, loose stones rattling down. Corinne did not think. She dropped into the trench beside Gus and began clawing dirt from around his leg with her bare hands. Stones scraped her palms open. Mud filled her nails. Gus was white-faced, teeth clenched, trying to push her away. "Get out, Corinne! The wall isn't stable. Be quiet. You talk too much." Mabel screamed for help. The children ran toward the road. Copper-barked hoarse, urgent raw barks that echoed off the hillside. And then from the gate behind them, a car door slammed. Corinne did not look up. She kept digging. But she heard the footsteps fast and uneven on the rough ground, and she heard the voice, her son's voice, strained and cracking, and saying a word he had not said with that particular weight in years. "Mom." She still did not look up. Her hands were bleeding and the dirt kept sliding back into the space she cleared. And Gus was gripping her forearm with a strength that surprised her. And somewhere above Dalton was standing at the edge of the collapsed trench, a thick folder of documents clutched in one hand, staring down at his mother, kneeling in the mud with blood on her palms, trying to save a man who had once been his father's best friend. In a ditch dug to find water for an orchard he had already agreed to sell. Every number in his head went silent. The folder slipped from his hand. The pages scattered across the caliche in the wind, and he did not reach for a single one. He jumped into the trench. He did not say anything else. He dropped to his knees in the mud beside her and started moving earth with his bare hands, scooping clay and gravel away from Gus's trapped leg. His dress shoes sliding on the whetstone, his shirt, pale blue, pressed that morning in a Houston hotel room, turning brown from the chest down. Corinne glanced at him once. His face was tight and pale, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, as if he was seeing for the first time the actual weight of what his mother had been carrying while he calculated acreage values in air-conditioned offices. Mabel threw down a shovel. A young man who had been watching from the fence climbed in, then another. Then Mayor Hargrove arrived, stood at the edge for 3 seconds with his mouth open, removed his jacket, and lowered himself into the trench with the careful slowness of a man who knows his niece will make him pay for this later. Nobody spoke about selling land. Nobody spoke about anything except the angle of the rope and the position of the boulder, and whether Gus could feel his toes. Gus could. He said so through clenched teeth, adding that he could also feel every single rock in Briar Hollow pressing on his shin bone, and that if everyone could stop asking about his toes and start moving the boulder, he would appreciate it. They rigged the rope around the boulder again. Dalton braced his shoulder against the channel wall. Corinne pulled from above her wrapped hands, slipping the cloth bandages soaked through with mud and blood. Mayor Hargrove and the young men levered from the side with the pickaxe and the cedar fence post. Mabel stood at the top directing operations with the authority of a field general and the volume of a cattle auctioneer. The boulder moved. Not gracefully, it ground against the channel floor, with a sound like a tooth being pulled, lurched sideways and settled into a new position 2 feet from where it had been. Gus's leg came free. He sat up immediately, face gray, and pointed deeper into the channel with a shaking hand. "We're close." The blockage was right there. Look at the stones. The channel curves just below where that boulder sat. If Harlan's drawings are right, the spring feed enters from the north side, just past that ledge. "You are out of your mind," Mabel said, already crying, which she attempted to disguise by wiping her face aggressively with her muddy sleeve. "You nearly lost your leg, and you want to keep digging." Gus looked at her with the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent 50 years reading the ground and was not about to stop listening to it now. "The leg is fine. The channel is right there." They kept digging, not because anyone gave an order, but because stopping felt impossible now that they could see the old stones curving downward beneath the clay exactly where Harlan had drawn them. Dalton dug beside his mother without speaking, his hands raw, his breathing hard. Corinne did not look at him. She did not need to. She could feel the change in the quality of his silence. It was no longer the silence of a man who wanted something from her, but the silence of a man who was trying to understand what he had almost destroyed. The last layer of packed sediment came away under Gus's shovel. Beneath it, the old limestone conduit was intact, its hand-laid stones fitted together with a precision that had survived 70 years of burial. And in the joint between two stones on the uphill side, a dark stain appeared, wet, spreading slowly. Nobody moved. A trickle of brown water seeped through the crack, then another slightly stronger. Then a thin, steady stream no wider than a finger, pushing silt ahead of it as it found the channel floor and began to follow the ancient curve downhill. The children clustered behind the fence erupted first. Their shouts broke open the silence like birds released from a cage. Mabel covered her mouth with both hands. Mayor Hargrove stood absolutely still. His eyes read, his jaw working. The older residents who had gathered along the fence looked at the water moving through the channel, the way people look at something they had given up hoping for. Not with joy exactly, but with the stunned tenderness of reunion. Gus knelt beside the flow. He put his hand in it and held it there, letting the cold, muddy water run between his fingers. Then he looked up at Corinne, and his voice when it came was rougher than she had ever heard it. He was right. Harlan was right. Corinne sat down in the dirt. She was shaking. Dalton crouched beside her and said her name, and she opened her eyes to the sound of water. Actual water moving through the stone, finding its way downhill after decades of silence, and extended one trembling hand into the stream. The muddy water stung the cuts on her palms, but she did not pull away. She rose with Dalton's help and walked slowly down the channel's path toward the orchard. The water followed. It was not much a thread, not a river. Not enough to turn the hills green overnight or fill a reservoir or solve the economics of a dying town. But it moved with the patient certainty of something that had always been there waiting beneath the surface for someone to clear the way. She reached the oldest pecan tree in the orchard, the one with the letter D carved into its trunk at the height a 5-year-old's hand could reach, and cupped water from the channel in her palms and poured it at the base. The ground drank it instantly. Dalton stood behind her. She heard his breathing catch when he saw the carving. He reached out and touched the letter with his muddy fingers, and for a long time he did not move, standing there with his hand on the bark like a man reading Braille in a language he had almost forgotten. That night the kitchen fire burned low. The water jug on the table had been replaced by a jar of actual channel water, still silty set there, not for drinking, but as proof. Copper was asleep near the door. Somewhere in the rafters, the barn cat that had adopted the house shifted and settled. Corinne was cleaning her hands in a basin of warm water when Dalton sat down across from her in Harlan's chair. He looked at the chair's arms as if recognizing where he was, then placed his hands flat on the table, palms up, the cuts and mud visible. "Mom, I have debts." She stopped wrapping her hand. She did not look surprised. He told her everything. The failed development deal in Houston, the money borrowed from a partner named Garrett, 60,000, not 40, because he had lied to Kara about the amount. The way Lone Star Ventures had approached him when he was most desperate, offering cash for the Briar Hollow property and a finder's fee if he could deliver the neighboring parcels. The deposit he had already accepted. The clause that required double repayment if he backed out. The assisted living idea, which had not been about her care at all, but about freeing a room so he could take remote clients to service the debt. "I told myself I was doing what was best for you," he said. And his voice broke on the last word, the way a branch breaks, not cleanly but with fibers still holding. "But I was just making everything smaller so it would fit into a solution that worked for me. The debt, the apartment, you. I made you part of a problem, Mom. I made you a line item." Corinne listened until he was finished. She did not reach across the table. She did not say the thing that mothers are expected to say, the thing that would have made them both feel better and changed nothing. "Yes, it matters, Dalton. You talked about selling your father's land and putting me in a facility without once asking me what I wanted. I understand that you were afraid. I understand that you failed, and the failure was heavy. But I will not act as if it didn't happen. He lowered his head. Tears fell on the backs of his hands, cutting thin lines through the dried mud. I'm sorry. The apology is the beginning, not the end. She looked through the window at the dark outline of the orchard, the silhouette of the old pecan tree against a sky full of stars that you could never see from Houston. I won't sign your father's land away for your debt, but if you want to fix this, I will watch you fix it. I won't do it for you. I won't hide it for you. I will only stand here so you know there is still a place you can come back to, but you no longer have the right to hurt that place. He nodded. He could not speak, and she did not need him to. In that kitchen, in the light of a fire built from cedar branches pulled off the land, his father had tended. Something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, which was too large and too important to arrive in a single evening, but the first careful clearing of the ground, where forgiveness might eventually take root. The weeks that followed were not miraculous. The water from the channel did not transform the hillside. It ran thin and muddy, and some days the flow weakened when debris accumulated upstream, and Gus had to limp up the slope with his cane and his shovel to clear it. The orchard did not burst into green. Most of the trees remained bare and gray, and some that Corinne had hoped were alive turned out to be dead through to the heartwood, and those had to be cut. The hardest was the tree near the back of the orchard, the one where Harlan had hung a rope hammock for young Dalton to nap in during summer afternoons. Corinne remembered the lullabies, the shade of the canopy on the boy's sleeping face, Harlan's quiet pride as he watched his son dream beneath branches he had pruned with his own hands. When Gus tested the trunk and shook his head, Corinne stood before it for a long time, her palm flat against the bark. Dalton took the axe. He stood in front of the trunk and hesitated the way you hesitate before saying something that cannot be unsaid. Corinne put her hand on the bark one last time. Some things can't be saved, son. But if it hurts to let them go, it means we still know what they were worth. The first stroke fell slow and heavy. When the trunk came down, the dust rose in the afternoon light like something being released. The next morning, Dalton and Gus dug a new hole nearby and planted a young pecan sapling. Corinne poured the first bucket of water herself and watched the small tree tremble in the wind, its few leaves catching the light. Dalton called Kara and told her the truth, all of it, including the parts he had hidden. The call was not easy. There were silences and recriminations and tears, but afterward, for the first time in months, he did not check his phone with the particular dread of a man waiting to be found out. He sold the car to repay part of the deposit to Lone Star Ventures. He negotiated a payment plan for the rest, accepting the penalty, accepting the loss of face, accepting that recovery would be slow and unglamorous. Mayor Hargrove suspended the land sale agreements. He did not cancel them outright. He was still the mayor, and paperwork was not as simple as emotion. But he announced that Briar Hollow would study the feasibility of restoring the old channel system before making any decisions about the town's future. Nobody objected aloud. The water was running. That was argument enough. Mabel organized a Saturday market on the Bellamy property. She said it was only to keep the children from trampling the orchard. But she arrived every Friday evening with a fresh batch of pecan pies and a hand-lettered sign that read, "Crenshaw's best in the hill country." No arguments. A retired neighbor brought a guitar. The children wrote market rules in crooked handwriting and nailed them to a post. No cheating on weights, no fighting near the pie table. Copper is allowed in the yard but not allowed to steal. Corinne read the rules and laughed a real laugh, the kind that starts deep and arrives without permission. And at the end of that winter, the first buds appeared. Not across the whole orchard, not in a blaze of miraculous restoration, but on a few branches that everyone had believed were dead. Small clusters of green began to unfurl, pale, tentative trembling in the wind. First one tree, then three, then a few more along the channel's path where the water had been reaching the roots longest. They were not dramatic. They were the quietest possible declaration of life made by trees that had spent years in silence, gathering what they needed from deep underground, waiting, not for rescue but for water. On the morning the buds opened, Corinne stood beneath the old pecan with the letter D on its trunk. The light came through the branches in long pale shafts, catching the new leaves so they glowed. She wore Harlan's scarf around her shoulders, though the morning was mild enough not to need it. Copper lay at her feet, his bad leg tucked beneath him, his ears twitching at the sound of children setting up the market tables behind the house. Gus appeared beside her, at some point the way he always did, without announcement, without greeting already present. He held 2 tin cups of coffee and extended one to her, without looking away from the branches. How many more you plan to plant next season? Depends on whether you still have the strength to dig the holes. If you still have the strength to boss me around, I still have the strength to dig. They stood together beneath the tree, not touching, not needing to. 2 people who had each lived alone with their losses long enough to understand that love at this age does not require declaration. It only requires that tomorrow there will be someone to walk out to the orchard with, to light the fire beside, to watch the buds open, and know that you are not waiting alone. From the kitchen doorway, the smell of coffee and cedar smoke drifted into the yard. Mabel's voice carried from the market table, scolding someone about pie placement. The guitar started up something slow, something old. Dalton was on the porch repairing a hinge on the market stall roof. And when Kara called that afternoon, she asked a question she had never asked before. How's the orchard? Corinne reached into her coat pocket and felt the brass key. She had carried it from Houston to the crossroads to the gate to this moment. It was warm from her hand, the way it always was, the way it had been on the night she chose to leave. On the afternoon she opened the door on every morning since when she unlocked the house to let the light in. She did not need to hold it so tightly anymore. But she kept it in her pocket anyway, not because she was afraid of losing the house, but because some things you carry not out of need but out of gratitude. The way you carry a name, the way you carry a song, you learn from someone who is gone. The pecan trees would not all survive. The town would not be saved by one channel of water. The debts would take years to repay. The distance between mother and son would not close with a single season of work. But the roots held, and the roots held, and a tree that everyone called dead had leafed out again late quiet, and no less beautiful for the waiting. Before we say goodbye today, thank you truly for staying with Corinne's story all the way to the end. These stories are made for you, and every time you listen, you remind us why we keep telling them. I want to leave you with one question tonight, and there is no wrong answer. Is there something in your own life, a place, a relationship, a dream, a part of yourself that you stopped watering because someone told you it was already dead? And if you went back to it even now, even late, what might still be alive beneath the surface? If Corinne's story moved you, leave a comment and tell us. And if you haven't yet subscribed, so the next story finds you right here whenever you're ready. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, late blooms are still blooms.